These answer choices have a few weird transitions. Choices A and B specifically kind of worry me a little bit, but C and D are words we've seen before, and they're pretty common. So similarly is going to make a comparison. It's kind of an and. By contrast, obviously, is maybe the opposite. It's going to be more like a but. So let's just see what we've got. We'll deal with the weird ones if we need to. Alexander Lawrence Posey varied his focus and tone depending on the genre in which he was writing. In his poetry, he used heartfelt language to evoke the beauty and peacefulness of his natural surroundings. So seems good. In his journalism, he employed humor and satire to comment on political issues affecting his Muskogee Creek community. I guess that's positive. Humor, I guess, is good. I don't know. If it's politics, though, that might be bad. This one maybe is more neutral or more mixed. So I don't know. That doesn't jump out then as a clear contrast. But it's definitely not a similarly, right? Because it's not saying he did the same thing in both situations, right? So his journalism is different from his poetry, right? So there's two things we are kind of talking about here. So it does feel like a compare-contrast situation, but they're not the same, right? In poetry, he's using heartfelt language. In journalism, he's using humor and satire. So maybe that's an opposite, because humor and specifically satire isn't really heartfelt necessarily. It's kind of like satire is like almost like you're lying in a way, or you're kind of maybe being a little sarcastic or using some sort of metaphor to kind of pull something down. So I don't know. It doesn't feel like a clear contrast, but it definitely doesn't feel like a similarly situation. Now that is more like in other words. We've seen this in another one in this set here. They're not repeating the same thing, right? So it's kind of the same reason that C is wrong, is they're not saying the same thing twice. They're talking about something different and giving us a different example. So that would be used if we were maybe talking about that same example again. Maybe we were giving an example of the heartfelt language in a poem. So that's not happening here. Granted is weird. I don't even have a good way to summarize this. Maybe it's like indeed. It has to do with like taking for granted. So it's almost like an assumption, but I just don't feel like that fits here. There is no assumption. It's not a grant. It's not like, oh, we should have known that his journalism had a different tone than his poetry. Like, why would we know that? Like, it doesn't, granted means almost like, yeah, like it's something we should have known beforehand, but I don't know this person, so it doesn't make any sense. So I don't feel like it's a very strong contrast, but I get what they're going for here. They are trying to juxtapose the poetry with the journalism. It doesn't feel like a clear contrast because they're not talking about positives and negatives in the way that we might want, but they're different things. They're saying he writes poetry differently than how he writes journalism, right? So that is the contrast. These are differences. And so maybe I took a longer route to get there, but I don't think it's super obvious. Maybe a lot of you are picking D because you know it's not C, and then you're too afraid of A and B to even consider them, and that's kind of okay. So just be aware that these other words exist, and we need to maybe understand what they mean, but they are rare. They're not going to come up very often, and so it's much more about C and D. Do we know what they mean, and can we kind of pull a comparison or a contrast out of this sentence? And yeah, it takes some work, but we can pull a contrast out, and so there you go. That's why D is right.